In the year 1838, deep within the fields of Georgia, a plantation owner lived burdened by his unrelenting desire to create a bloodline that would outlive him, his wealth, and his legacy. He believed his name must echo across the generations carried by children who bore his mark, yet fate had dealt him a blow that no amount of power could undo. His wife, though elegant, devoted, and by all social standards ideal, was unable to conceive. The diagnosis of sterility hung over their grand estate like a haunting mist, and in a society that prized heirs above affection, the failure to produce a child was seen as both a personal shame and a divine punishment. The owner's pride could not accept such a void, and rather than surrender to it, he devised a plan so cruel and cold that it reflected the darkest nature of the institution he upheld. The enslaved men and women who labored in his fields were not seen as human beings to him, but as property resources and instruments of his will. He began to view them as vessels through which he could manufacture life, even if it was not born from love or equality. His logic was simple and twisted. If his wife could not bear him children, then the enslaved women would. The cruelty was deepened by the fact that he demanded his wife watch the acts he called necessary for legacy, ensuring she was both witness and participant in his descent into moral ruin. Each night when the moon rose above the endless rows of cotton and the air grew heavy with the sounds of the swamp, he would summon one of the enslaved women to the main house. His wife sat beside him, trapped in silence, her heart torn between horror and obedience. To defy him would be to risk everything. Her status, her safety, and perhaps her life for the law of the South was written by men like him, men who owned not only bodies, but voices and destinies. She became a living statue, her eyes forced to absorb what her soul could not bear. The slaves, too, had no choice, for refusal meant punishment of unimaginable pain. Thus, within those walls, the lines between power and depravity blurred until all that remained was suffering. The owner told himself that his actions were justified, that he was ensuring the continuation of his blood, even though the truth was, he sought only to conquer what nature had denied him. He began keeping records of every union as if breeding humans were no different, then pairing livestock, noting which women were most fertile and which offspring resembled him most closely. As the years passed, the estate grew in both wealth and whispers. The enslaved community bore the silent weight of generations born from coercion and grief. Each child carried not only the mark of their father's cruelty, but also the unspoken sorrow of their mothers who could never claim their children as their own in freedom. The wife, meanwhile, became a shadow of herself. Her reflection mocked her in every mirror, reminding her that she was both spectator and prisoner. She prayed for death or deliverance, but neither came, and so she endured, watching her husband descend further into madness. At times she thought she saw pity in the eyes of the enslaved women, pity for the lady forced to watch their torment, and perhaps they shared a bond of suffering, though neither could speak of it aloud. In the cruel order of the South, the master was untouchable, the mistress was voiceless, and the slaves were nameless. There were nights when the owner would drink heavily, staring into the flickering light of the fireplace, speaking to his wife about destiny and God. He claimed that every soul under his command was part of a divine plan that justified his cruelty, but even he could not hide the emptiness that grew inside him. For though he fathered children by force, he could not claim them openly. They were marked by the color of their mother's skin, and society would never allow such offspring to inherit his name or estate. His obsession had birthed only more misery, proving that the power he thought divine was merely a reflection of his own decay. In the silence of those nights, his wife would weep not only for herself, but for the women whose pain she had been forced to witness. She began to understand that her suffering, though deep, was not unique, for the entire system around her was built upon the suffering of others. The mansion that stood so proudly on the hill was founded on tears and chains, its beauty masking the rot beneath. In time, the owner's health began to fail, and with it his authority waned. The children he had sired lived on the fringes of the estate, neither free nor truly enslaved, caught between two worlds that rejected them. When the owner finally died, his wife inherited the empty shell of his empire and the ghosts of every soul wronged within its walls. Her final days were spent in silence, walking through the abandoned halls where the echoes of cries still lingered. She realized too late that her complicity, though forced, had bound her soul to the cruelty she had witnessed. The story of that plantation stands as a testament to the depth of human depravity when power is left unchecked and empathy erased. It reveals how the hunger for legacy can devour not only the innocent, but also the one who seeks to play God. In Georgia's soil lay countless untold stories like hers, each soaked in sorrow, each reminding us that history's grandeur often hides its greatest sins. The sterile wife lived in a grand Georgian mansion surrounded by acres of cotton fields, yet within her heart there was only emptiness. She had once believed that her marriage would bring love, stability, and honor, but in a world ruled by power and legacy, her worth was measured only by her ability to bear children. When the doctors and midwives finally whispered that she could never conceive, she felt something inside her break, though she did not yet know how deep her suffering would go. Her husband, the master of the plantation, could not accept a barren wife, for he saw children as proof of manhood and as heirs to his empire. His frustration soon turned into cruelty, and in his arrogance he devised a twisted punishment that would wound both her soul and the enslaved women he commanded. He forced her to watch as he violated the enslaved women under the pretense of ensuring his lineage. To him this was an act of control and creation, but to her it was an unending nightmare that stripped away every trace of dignity and faith. Night after night she was summoned to witness scenes that shattered her mind. She would sit silent, trembling as her husband performed his acts of dominance while the enslaved women stood in quiet submission, their eyes filled with grief. Each moment seared into her memory until she no longer knew whether she was the victim or the accomplice. The plantation that once stood as a symbol of Southern gentility had become a house of torment where intimacy was twisted into power and suffering. The wife's days were spent in silence, wandering through gilded halls haunted by the echoes of cries and the weight of shame. She could not look at the enslaved women without feeling both guilt and helplessness, for she knew they endured pain far greater than her own, yet she was powerless to stop it. Her husband demanded her presence at every act, insisting that she acknowledge his control over every life within. The estate, even hers, the sterile wife's identity, slowly dissolved as she was reduced to a spectator of cruelty. She began to lose track of time and of herself. The other women whispered about her behind closed doors, calling her cursed or cold, but none could see the storm within her. She wanted to scream, to run, to defy him, yet every door was locked by the laws of men who saw women as possessions. Her suffering became a silent protest, though no one could hear it. She began to see the enslaved not as property as her husband did, but as mirrors reflecting the pain of a world built on domination. Their eyes spoke truths she could never utter, truths about bondage, despair, and survival. In their endurance she saw courage greater than her own, and it shamed her for remaining still. Each passing year deepened her torment. The children born of her husband's cruelty played in the fields, growing strong beneath the same sun that scorched their mothers' backs. The mistress watched them from afar, torn between pity and horror, knowing that they were living symbols of her humiliation. Her husband boasted of his virility to guests, claiming divine favor, while she sat beside him silent like an ornament at his table. The sterile wife began to realize that the plantation was a prison not only for the enslaved but also for her, for its walls were built on lies and chains invisible yet unbreakable. Her nights became filled with visions of blood and tears. She dreamed of the enslaved women reaching out to her in the dark, their hands stained with earth, their faces streaked with sorrow. In her dreams she tried to free them, but her own hands were bound by invisible cords woven from fear and obedience. When she awoke, she felt their pain lingering in her chest and wondered whether God had turned his face away from the estate entirely. She prayed for forgiveness, though she knew no prayer could cleanse what had been done within those walls. The plantation owner saw none of this. He believed himself untouchable, a master chosen by fate to rule over land and flesh. He called his acts breeding, not cruelty, convinced that legacy excused all sin. Yet the sterile wife knew that no lineage born from suffering could endure without curse. She saw his pride grow even as his humanity decayed. His eyes hardened, his laughter turned to bitterness, and the warmth of their early years vanished completely. The house grew darker with each generation of children he refused to acknowledge, and, though the fields flourished, the souls within them withered. One day the wife could bear it no longer. She walked through the slave quarters, her heart heavy with shame and pity. The women looked at her not with hatred but with a sorrowful understanding, as if they knew she too was trapped. In that moment she felt the fragile thread that connected them, not as mistress and slave, but as women broken by the same man. She realized then that her silence had been his greatest weapon, and her complicity his shield. She wanted to speak the truth, but truth had no place in a world built on power. As years turned into decades, the plantation became haunted by whispers. Travelers spoke of strange cries heard in the night and of a pale woman seen wandering the veranda, her eyes empty, her lips moving in wordless prayer. When the master finally died, the wife remained alone in a house filled with ghosts. The enslaved were scattered. The fields fell silent, and the walls still seemed to breathe the memory of pain. She spent her final years in solitude, walking among the empty rooms, remembering every face, every night, every scream. She understood at last that the true horror was not only her husband's cruelty, but the silence that allowed it to flourish. In that silence, she had lost her soul just as surely as the enslaved had lost their freedom. When death finally came for her, it was said she met it without fear, for she no longer belonged to the living. Her story became a whisper carried through generations, a tale of a woman who saw too much and spoke too little. It stands as a reminder that evil thrives not only through the hands that commit it, but through the eyes that watch and do nothing. The story of the plantation owner and his sterile wife reveals the grim intersection of power, race, and gender. In a world where human beings were stripped of identity and turned into instruments of dominance. In Georgia during 1838, the boundaries between cruelty and culture blurred as society justified atrocity through the language of tradition and divine right. The master of the estate believed himself chosen by providence and entitled to control not only the land and the people upon it, but also the course of life itself. His authority was absolute, his word was law, and in that arrogance lay the seed of his corruption. When his wife was declared barren, his obsession with legacy consumed him, turning his pursuit of lineage into an act of monstrous pride. He began to use the enslaved as living vessels, breeding them like animals to continue his name, even though their blood could never be acknowledged in polite society. The act itself was not only physical domination but also a spiritual violation, for it desecrated the sanctity of creation. The enslaved women were forced to bear children who would never be free children, born into chains and sorrow. The sterile wife, though innocent in flesh, was bound by complicity in spirit, forced to witness her husband's cruelty as both punishment and proof of his control. Her silence became a prison, her obedience a curse. Through her eyes the world appeared hollow, stripped of meaning and mercy. She began to understand that her power as mistress was an illusion, sustained only by the suffering of others. The system that gave her status also took away her humanity, reducing her to an ornament of pain. For the enslaved community, the master's breeding acts were a daily horror that shattered the last fragments of dignity they tried to preserve. Families were torn apart. Mothers were forced to raise children born from violence, and fathers could only watch powerless as their loved ones were taken. Yet within that darkness there remained quiet defiance. The enslaved whispered prayers beneath the moonlight, sang songs of freedom, and held faith that one day justice would rise from the soil watered by their tears. Their resilience stood in silent contrast to the moral decay of their oppressors. The plantation thrived outwardly, its fields rich with cotton and wealth, yet every fiber carried the unseen weight of agony. The master believed he could shape destiny through power, but destiny has a way of humbling those who try to own it. His children, though many, were never truly his, for society would not accept them, nor could he love them without confronting his own guilt. He had created life but destroyed every trace of compassion within himself. His wife watched him with growing dread, seeing how greed for control had devoured his soul. She prayed for deliverance but found none, for God seemed silent in the land of chains. Over time she began to see the enslaved not as inferiors, but as reflections of her own captivity. Though her cage was gilded, it was still a cage, and in that realization, her heart turned from pride to pity. The intersection of race and gender in this tragedy exposes how oppression multiplies when one group claims divine right over another. The wife suffered under the tyranny of patriarchy, just as the enslaved suffered under the tyranny of bondage. Both were bound by laws written by men who valued possession over compassion. The plantation became a theater of cruelty, where every role was dictated by power and every act performed under the gaze of a system too blind to see its own decay. Yet even in silence the truth endured. Each birth forced upon the enslaved women was a reminder that life cannot be owned, and that suffering carries memory deeper than any ledger or title. As the years passed, whispers spread beyond the plantation. Travelers spoke of strange happenings, of a mistress who wandered the halls pale as ash, and of cries that echoed through the night. Some said the land itself was cursed, that the blood spilled upon it would never allow peace to grow. The master aged into bitterness, his health crumbling beneath the weight of his sins. The sterile wife aged into sorrow, her face etched with the memory of every act she had been forced to witness. The enslaved continued to labor, their eyes hardened by endurance, but their spirit unbroken. For even in bondage they held the one thing the master could never own: hope. When the master finally died, his name faded into history, leaving behind only ruins and rumors. The wife remained a ghost among the living, wandering through the empty rooms where once she had watched so much pain unfold. She died without children, without legacy, and without peace. The enslaved who survived carried the stories of that place in whispers, passing them from generation to generation until they became part of a hidden history written not in books but in memory. This tale stands as a mirror reflecting the darkness of a society that valued power more than humanity. It shows how gender and race were bound together in chains of domination, each reinforcing the other, until compassion itself became a weakness. The sterile wife's suffering was born from the same system that enslaved others, proving that tyranny consumes all within its reach. The plantation owner sought to create life, but in his pursuit, he destroyed every bond that made life sacred. The enslaved women endured the unthinkable, yet through their endurance they preserved the truth of their existence while their oppressor faded into dust. In the end, this story is not only about cruelty, but about the cost of silence and the illusion of control. It reminds us that history's grandeur is often built upon suffering, and that beneath every monument of power lie the bones of those who had none. The plantation's legacy is not wealth or lineage, but the memory of every soul broken and every voice silenced. Through that memory comes understanding, and through understanding perhaps a fragment of redemption for those who choose to see.